Hi guys, this is the Lament Configuration horror podcast. I'm Greg Knox. It's spring of 2018 and I'm joined by everyone's second favourite online partially clothed Mancunian after Jason Manford reoffend.
Thank you for the intro there, Greg. And yes, I am back for yet another show because horror always needs a final girl, and for the Lament Configuration podcast, I am that. And for this show, you will need your compasses at the ready.
Ooh, why is that?
Well, we shall talk about that later.
Ooh, have to wait and see.
Spoilers and in-jokes.
Cool. So I'm really looking forward to the show today because on the next two shows, what we're going to be covering is Italian, yes, my favourite, horror films, split into two different types of categories. So on the show today, what we're going to be talking about is slasher films. So we did a whole slasher film special last Halloween with Tom Dennett-Cook. Shout out to Mr. Dennett-Cook. But we didn't cover any of these films for whatever reason. It just never came up because I was saving it for this show. So if you're listening to one of our shows, please expect bad language, particularly from me because I love swearing. Please expect possible offensive content, but we try and avoid that where possible. And also expect spoilers.
And sexually explicit film content discussion as well. We are uncensored in a nutshell.
Yes, we are very, very, very uncensored. So let's get on with the show. The first film we're going to talk about today is a very kind of nasty film and also quite a notorious one for several different reasons, which has the awesome title Nightmares in a Damaged Brain, which is directed by Romano Scavolini, who has actually directed a giallo. There's a surprise called The White Dress for Mariala, which is actually pretty good. This has the alternative titles of Nightmare, just Nightmare, Schizo, and Blood Splash, which makes it sound like some kind of evil swimming pool sort of film.
There's another film that we could make there, hey?
Yes, about an evil swimming pool.
Mm-hmm.
And Rhea is going to give you a usual synopsis and her thoughts on the film itself.
Yeah, so it's a 1981 film. In fact, all three of the films that we're going to talk about this episode are either 1980 or 81, and quite similar as well. And the synopsis for Nightmare is a mental patient embarks on a murder spree upon escaping from an institution. Very simple synopsis there. Yeah, it is what it says on the tin, to be fair. Quite brutal. I quite liked this film. I was very surprised. I've never seen any of the films we're about to talk about in this episode, and pleasantly surprised I was with this one. I'm glad that I finally watched it because I've heard a lot about it on the kind of video nasties and horror gore scene, and this one in particular is known by horror fans as being particularly brutal. Would you agree, Greg?
Yeah, it's brutal and it's also quite grim and nihilistic as well. This is actually one of the more nihilistic nasties, I would say. This and Driller Killer are quite sort of grim, I would say.
Yeah, it's definitely one of those that if you're into horror, you need to see. I'm quite surprised I've not seen it up until this point. But yeah, it was banned for an awfully long time, and I can see why.
Yeah, so this film is quite notorious for a couple of different reasons. The first one is that the UK video distributor, he got put in prison for sending out a version that was longer than the BBFC allowed it to be, so it included banned material. So yeah, so this film actually caused someone to go to prison, which is pretty fucked up.
Do we know what the material was, or is that kind of not spoken about?
I wouldn't say it would be spoken about really in any great detail. It doesn't really matter. It's just they decided, no, you've got to cut this, this, and this, and then they released a version that had that material in it. So off to prison he went.
Wow, imagine that these days. It just wouldn't happen, would it?
No, although you never know. The Tories are in charge, but let's not get too political on the show.
Yeah, let's not. So, I mean, starting with, our main character, our lead, who has been in an institution, he's called George Tatum. So most of the story revolves around him. And I've got noted down that the opening scene is really epic. I mean, effectively, it's like a dream sequence. Seems like a dream or a flashback, and then he wakes up and it's not really real. But the effect of that opening scene is incredible. It's really gory. He's in bed. He's severed a woman and all of her body parts are all over the bed, and he wakes up screaming, and he's in a lab. He's being kind of restrained and tested. He's in a straitjacket. He gets sedated. He's spoken of as schizophrenic, and then it's followed up by some rather slinky lounge and jazz music as like the opening to the film. So it's all rather bizarre with this kind of frantic opening with this then kind of calm opening music, which is completely contrasting to that.
Yeah, so I feel that if you break down the film into like three different sections, I would say the most effective section to me is this opening third of the film, where it's just about George Tatum, as you said. So he's this paranoid schizophrenic. He's been released from this mental institution, which is absolutely hilarious when you think about it, as in like, well, what did they think was going to happen?
Yeah, and at regular points throughout the film, they've got various doctors or reporters discussing the fact that he might not be that dangerous, or he doesn't seem to be that dangerous. And it's as though they haven't really looked into why he is doing the things that he's doing and why he's so mentally disturbed. They've just written it down as like, yeah, he's paranoid schizophrenic. He has these weird dreams. We don't really know why. They've not looked into it.
No.
And you would think that they already knew this, because as we get in all the flashbacks throughout the film, something happened to him that was very terrible as a child, and he is now an adult. So they've had all those years to find out exactly what happened. And of course, when you're speaking to a child, if you take them into like mental health care, then you would expect a child to be really honest, because they don't know what to censor or not censor in order to function in the world. So you would expect that a child would be brutally honest about any wrong happenings or things that they may have seen. So that's your opportunity to ask, really, when he's like 8 years old or however old he is at the beginning. So you would think that they already knew his history at this point.
Yeah, you'd have thought so, but apparently not. Apparently these are sort of the most inept sort of psychiatric unit in history.
Yeah, and they're totally up for releasing this guy, into the general public, despite what behaviour he's exhibited in the past and all of these crazy dreams that make him wake up absolutely screaming.
Yeah. Now, talking about the actor who plays George Tatum, I actually felt his performance was really good. It is very, very grungy, as I said. As I mentioned earlier, it sort of reminded me of because the film, it came out in 80 or 81. But it has that sort of late 70s American feel to it, even though it's directed by an Italian. So it's got that feel of films like Driller Killer or Don't Go in the House, or another film that this has been compared to quite a lot, which is Maniac.
Yeah, and I haven't seen Maniac yet. I really need to see that film. But I totally agree with you on the late 70s American feel of Driller Killer. And I think that is one of the types of banned video nasty horror that I really like, because I love that American feel. And they do really go to town with the shock value and the gore. And it may not always be that realistic in terms of special effects and gore, but it still has a really amazing impact on screen, even if you know it's not real. It's just like, you know it's a horror film because it's not that realistic. And it allows you to appreciate that about the filmmaking, the kind of more independent sort of filmmaking, grungy look, as you mentioned as well. It does feel quite sort of punk rock, edgy, and just kind of on that New York underground scene that was around at the time when films were getting banned.
And it's got a scene in New York itself, when New York was like the seediest place in all of America, which, if it's got that in it, then obviously clearly it's going to be very seedy. And in that first third of the film, as I said, you've got this section of George going to, like, I guess a nudie bar or whatever those places are called, where he goes
Yeah.
to a peep show, and you've got a woman touching herself with a vibrator, not in that way, but it's clearly that's what's supposed to be happening. And yeah, it does have a very sleazy kind of feel to it, especially with him sort of freaking out, having an epileptic fit, foaming at the mouth,
Yeah, it's really over the top, but he clearly has this mental issue with some kind of sexual connection that makes him, get very overwhelmed, and he's extremely fucked up about it. So he has these seizures when he gets like overwhelmed, and he has phone sex with one of the women, and it all gets a bit too much for him, and he does start foaming at the mouth. And it is really over the top, but it is also pretty cool. And the sleazy nature of the whole New York setting and the stripper bar and everything, I quite liked it because it's almost done in bad taste, but overtly. And it does have that kind of raw feel that like Driller Killer had. And there's something about it that I like because it just feels like it shouldn't have been made, but it kind of knows that as well.
Yeah, I totally see where you're coming from with that, actually, yeah. So it's not like, I don't know, because it's weird, because the killer is this sort of psychologically disturbed person, it's not like just a cold killer like you get in the normal slasher film, like you would get in like a Friday the 13th, for example. It is this psychologically very disturbed person. So yeah, it's just feels very different. And in this film as well, you've got sort of scenes of, there's a child that gets killed at one point, for fuck's sake. So that it goes there.
Yeah, and like you get these kind of hints as to what happened to him as a child, but all is not revealed fully until the end, which is great for suspense. And that you kind of get an inkling of what's happened, but it also keeps you wanting to know more and wanting to know specifically what happened. And that's not revealed until later. But yeah, the actor who plays Tatum, I thought gave a fantastic performance. That's then kind of spliced with the kids who are connected with him. So there's the character called CJ, who's almost like a bit of a modern day mirror image of him, and you wonder what the connection is throughout the film. And the kids that are looked after by the babysitter, which is then kind of the next part of the film, their acting is absolutely abysmal. And I know we didn't have probably the best quality of acting back then, and especially with child actors, but it's a little over the top. And as you say, it's maybe part of the film that doesn't bring so much to it, but overall still very well structured. And I liked the storyline and the way it builds the suspense to the big reveal at the end.
Yeah, so the actor who plays George Tatum, his name's Baird Stafford, and yeah, he's really good. He's very, very believable, and he's almost sympathetic in a way, like with his portrayal. I agree with what you're saying though about the child actors. I think the child who's CJ in the film, I think he is supposed to be annoying, so you are supposed to be annoyed by him and the things he does. And the whole film is about essentially the sins of the father repeating on the son, which is a little bit heavy-handed the way that they deal with that in some ways, because particularly the very, very last shot, because I didn't think they needed to do that shot. I think it was pretty obvious that's what's happening.
I agree, yeah. And it is clever the way it's split up into the days, so it's the first, second and third day. Does break it down and does again make you wonder where this is going, and then it obviously leads to the final day. But yeah, I mean, yeah, it's maybe a little too overt, but then again, back then it's like they probably felt like they had to fill in all of the gaps, whereas these days you can leave things out of a film and not explain it, and people may ask for an explanation at a later date, say with Twin Peaks-esque style storytelling. You know that you're not going to get things explained. People still will discuss it and talk about it online, etc., etc., but they may not expect a full explanation at any point, whereas I think back then it was a little more simplified in the 80s, where you expected an explanation as to fill in the gaps in the storyline.
Well, I mean, it's so obvious though what's going on. Like they really, really do sort of hammer you over the head with it. So this guy George Tatum, you know, he leaves this mental institution. Bear in mind, he doesn't escape; he's allowed to leave, and then he snaps essentially because he sees these women in these sexual situations. At least that was my interpretation of what was going on. And then he kills a woman, steals her car, and then goes to this family, and it's like, oh, the dad's not there. What's going on? And in fact, like the mum, even at one point in the film, she says something along the lines of that basically, oh, I've repainted the house the day after he left, the day CJ was born. So I'm like, I wonder what could be going on here then. It's like, if it wasn't obvious enough. And then they treat like the last 2 minutes of the film like this really big twist ending about like, oh, really? Yeah, he's their father. And it's like, he's this woman's ex-husband. It's like, well, no shit.
Yeah, I know. It is really obvious. At that point when she mentioned that the father left the day after he was born, I was just like, oh, I actually did laugh out loud because I was like, this is so obvious. But I still enjoyed it, and I did feel that it was kind of had a lot of the feeling of Driller Killer, where there was a trigger to his behaviour. He was fine. Then there was a trigger which made him remember something terrible that happened to him, and then craziness ensues from there. So I did think it was very enjoyable. And for this, I've got 9 deaths, which debatably is 8, because the first one is more of a dream sequence that he wakes up from. So there's probably 8 actual deaths in this film, which is pretty high death count. Not as high as Driller Killer, but still up there.
Yeah, so the scene you're talking about is literally the first thing that happens in the film. So you're given no opportunity to sort of relax into the film whatsoever. So you've got George Tatum on his bed, and he wakes up, and there's a severed woman's head at the end of his bed with guts and entrails sort of spread around all over the place, and then the head wakes up. Now, the effects are not that great, admittedly, but then again, it's a low budget film that, you know, looks as if it was made in the 70s, which I'm going to touch on in a minute as to sort of there's quite an interesting sort of backstory behind that. But it is a very, very effective cold open, I think. I'm like, fuck.
Yeah, I did. I actually thought that was one of the most redeeming aspects of this film. I think quite often an opening like that can really make a film if it's done well, and I think this is one of those occasions where it really has been. And then some of the other deaths were really cool as well, but that obviously did sort of lead to, I think, beginning and end of this film like really rounds it all up and really makes it what it is. As for other parts of the film, I mean, there was one part of the film that I found really quite annoying. I'm going to ask you, what was the part of the film that you found the most irritating in terms of predictable and just kind of, you know, shouldn't have been included? Is there something that you could pick out? Because I've got one point to pick out, but I'm going to see if you say the same as me.
I mean, the narrative does switch very, very abruptly about a third of the way into the film. So it starts off really being all about George Tatum, and then George Tatum is kind of relegated to this background figure almost. So the story isn't about him, it's about this kid CJ, like we said. And there's a lot of scenes of him sort of terrorizing babysitters for some reason or other. There's one scene where he pretends that he's been stabbed.
Yeah, that's the exact scene that I was going to mention, the ketchup joke.
Yeah, which I kind of get that if they had played it off in that, because if you think like you've got this kid who, as a practical joke, pretends to be attacked and pretends to be injured and stuff like that, you would have a scene where he actually does get injured and the parents won't believe him. That's kind of what you would do as an obvious kind of follow-up to that. But it's never really followed through. It's more just, well, the kid's fucked up. And that's it.
It's more this whole boy who cried wolf thing, and he gets kind of involved in the deaths and crime, and we don't know who's doing the killings? Is it him? Is it Tatum? What's going on? So he's kind of twisted up in this mess because he plays so many practical jokes and he's a little bit fucked up. And it's like, oh, why is he so fucked up? And it's obvious to us that he is the son of Tatum, so, you know, that's where it's come from, the same as Tatum kind of got it from his dad in a way, I guess. So there is that kind of father figure and it being passed down through the generations, which is kind of a cool aspect of this film. But yeah, it goes off into this whole love story of her with her new fella, him being the kind of father figure they never had, Tatum being fucked up and CJ being his fucked up son, and him playing these practical jokes that never really plays out, as you say, as the boy who cried wolf story. It's a little protracted and tedious and obvious. So the ketchup fake stabbing scene for me went on a little too long, and I was quite angry. I know he's supposed to be, that he's played this joke, but it's just kind of felt like a really cheap, unnecessary part of the film, so I wasn't into that.
Yeah. Now, quite interesting. Did you know The Shining came out in 1980? Now, a reason I asked that is because there are two films that we're going to talk about on the show today that actually borrow a quite key scene from The Shining. This is one of them, where you've got the killer breaking down a door and looking through it.
Yeah, I noticed that it was out of two films out of the three that we're going to discuss was a part of it, and just thought, everybody's latched onto this trend. And they couldn't use the one-liner because it would be too obvious that they'd ripped it off, but everybody seemed to want to do that as well at this time. So you can see plenty of Shining rip-offs, which is kind of a shame, but also at the same time I can see why they did it, because it was such a cool moment in like horror films of that era.
Yes. Also, it's quite interesting that I talked about sort of the effect earlier. So, right near the end of the film, there is a flashback, which are probably my favourite deaths in the whole film, which is your decapitation of a woman and, as a child, George Tatum killing his father, literally whacking an axe right in the middle of his head, which is very grisly, and I thought quite well done.
Yeah, it was very well done actually, even though again, like you can say, like we said earlier, you can tell that it is that kind of late 70s special effects, not really too realistic, but it's very well shot. The head coming off, the decapitated neck with the blood splurting out, the blood flying around the room, and him actually putting the axe visibly into his father's head whilst he's tied to the bed, is very, very effective and quite shocking. Everything is white as well, including her lingerie, and it's just all very well kind of set up. I think he's in quite a smart white shirt as well. He looks like he's come from church or somewhere like that, somewhere very respectable. So yeah, it's just very well done, and yeah, probably one of the best scenes of the film. So you've got this at the beginning of the film, you've got this amazing death scene, and then you've got these two amazing deaths at the end. So like I say, it's very well rounded, with a little bit too much padding in the middle perhaps, but hey, nobody's perfect. It's a great film overall.
Yeah, now the reason I mentioned the special effects is that the other reason that this film is quite notorious is because Tom Savini was originally listed as the special effects supervisor on the film. Now, I mentioned Maniac earlier, he did the special effects for that. Previously, he did special effects in The Burning, which we talked about earlier in the series. However, apparently Mr. Savini did not do the effects, as he is very, very keen to sort of make sure everyone is aware of. However, he was on the film just as a consultant, just to make sure the effects sort of went smoothly, I guess, because you've got a decapitation, and they hadn't really done that many decapitations, I think, in film at that point. So, yeah, I thought, again, it's quite interesting.
So do you think that's easier on the budget if they just have him as a consultant?
Yeah, I imagine so. I imagine this film didn't cost a lot of money to make.
Yeah, because, I mean, if they would have had him, it obviously would have probably cranked that up a notch in terms of making it that bit more special, but I feel like it was enough that it worked really well. And you tend to be able to tell if Tom Savini's had a hand in a film like that, because it has a particular look and nobody does it as well as he does, particularly in that era. But yeah, I mean, this is kind of, it feels like a midway point. It's not like full Tom Savini-esque, but it's very well done. I enjoyed those aspects of the film.
Yes, they are very good. They are very good. And the deaths as a whole are pretty well done. So there are various scenes of people getting stabbed. Thought they looked quite convincing as well.
Yeah, it does. So the little boy dies, which you don't see. There's a strangulation and there's a claw hammer to the wrist and back, which is quite an effective stabbing scene, which is Kathy, who is the babysitter.
Yes, yeah. So she dies fairly near the end of the film.
Yeah, so there's a few deaths where you don't actually see anything, you just kind of see the aftermath. But that's one of the stabbing scenes where you actually see the claw hammer go into the skin, and it does look quite realistic, actually.
Yeah, it does. It's quite gruesome, isn't it?
Yeah.
So there are just a couple of other things that I just thought were quite amusing, because there's often sort of amusing things to find in films from this time frame, particularly on this level of budget. I did like the really old computer that somehow knew where Tatum was.
Oh, I loved that. And then it got a red screen when things were getting really tense.
It's like, where is George Tatum likely to be? He's 90% likely to be in this place where his family is, and the police or the psychiatrist haven't figured that out themselves. They needed an old computer to point this out.
Yeah, and it did actually give you like a list of his mental issues. So it's like his diagnosis on screen: schizophrenia, mild amnesia, homicidal, dream fixation, and seizures. What's that? He's homicidal? Well, I guess it's okay to release him then.
Yeah. The other thing that I thought was quite funny, because this isn't really a funny film, but the guy who plays the cop, when he's having these conversations with the psychiatrist, he does come out with some quite funny lines. So the best one, which is, "Sorry, you're a dangerously psychotic patient from a secret experimental drug program, and all you can say is I'm sorry."
Yeah, I loved that part. It was so funny. He goes absolutely crazy, and it's like, well, you would go crazy, but this whole film is like set up in that kind of way where you're just like, yeah, you wouldn't let that happen.
Yeah, and he also says in the most understated way imaginable, like about 2/3 of the way through the film. So they're driving all the way to Florida to try and catch this guy, and he's having this very serious conversation with the psychiatrist, and it's like, look, you tried to cure him, but now he's out there killing people, and we can't have that. Just like,
Do you think?
Yeah, we can't have that. It's just not on. It's very bad form. Just out there murdering people.
Yeah, I quite liked the one of those obvious horror film tropes where they had the boyfriend type figure taking photos of the house because she wants to sell it for some unknown reason. And then when they look at the photos, there's a man's figure at the window. Ooh. But then they look up at the window and he's not there. It's like a really obvious horror film trope.
He's hiding. And also, because it's a slasher film, you do have Kathy's boyfriend who sneaks in. There's a fake scare involving him. And then he makes a mistake. We're going to go and smoke a joint. And then obviously he gets killed for A, having sex, and B, smoking a joint. So, gotta love slashers.
So obvious, but, you know, also essential, probably, as well. And there's quite a nice touch where a couple of times throughout the film, Tatum is seen licking his bloody fingers. And then at the end, CJ like winks, and it's all kind of like that. It's been passed down, you know. But I thought that was quite grim, actually, where he's got the blood all over him, and then he's licking his fingers like he kind of wants to taste it and he's enjoying it. There's like a big pause in between and a bit of a build up to that, and you're not expecting it. So I thought that was really well done.
Awesome. So come to the point of the review where I'm going to ask you, should Nightmares in a Damaged Brain have been a video nasty?
I don't know. I think I'm on the fence with this one.
Well, I mean, I'm a little bit on the fence as well. I'm leaning more one way than the other. And now, essentially, you've got the overall feel of the film, which is quite downbeat and quite nihilistic, as I've said. There isn't any one incident in the film particularly that pushes it too much one way or the other. But it is kind of relentlessly grim, I would say.
Agree. I think with the presence of a child chopping into his dad's head, and also the sexual nature of the strip bar and the vibrator scene where she's got her legs open, etc., which is quite brash, let's say.
Yes.
I would say I am on the fence because I don't feel like it would be banned right now. It would be fine, but I can see why they banned it back then. So I'm going to say yes to Video Nasty, although I was unsure on this decision.
Yeah, and I'm kind of leaning either side myself, as I said. I'm going to also say yes, only because, as I said, the film's tone, and because there are some sleazy parts of it, like, and also because I've also mentioned that films like, I don't know, Toolbox Murders and Don't Go in the House, I've also said should have been Video Nasties. Driller Killer, interestingly, I said shouldn't have been, but hey. But yeah, I'm also going to say yes.
Yeah, you can't win them all. Yeah, I'm going to say yes to this one, so we'll add that to the score.
Yeah, okay, so they're both yeses. Now, interestingly, you're talking about whether it's available on DVD. It is available on DVD, because I own it. It's available from 88 Films. You can buy it right now from them. It's available completely uncut. So, yeah.
Yeah, I don't have this on DVD just yet. I have managed to acquire it on VHS, which is interesting, so quite fine there.
Very, very old school. But yeah, it's an interesting film, I would say. I would say it's pretty good. I would say it's quite entertaining. It does have a couple of annoying bits, particularly with the children, I would say. But overall, it's pretty nasty stuff without being too offensive, shall we say.
Yeah, I think this is a must-see for horror fans, especially if you like Driller Killer. So, yeah.
Yes. Now, interestingly, that film was a film that has a feel of an American film, was probably an American production, was directed, though, by an Italian. This is a film that's directed by an Italian that feels incredibly Italian, although set in Greece, oddly enough.
Yeah, I did note the kind of Greek-influenced music throughout this, which is quite funny.
Yes, we're talking about Anthropophagus, alternatively Anthropophagus the Beast, or the Grim Reaper, or the Savage Island, or the Man Eater, or the Man Beast, or the Zombie's Rage.
It's a lot of alternative titles.
Yes, very, very many alternative titles. This is directed by Joe D'Amato, which is not his real name. This is the real name of Aristide Massachesi, who is quite an interesting director. He's sort of similar in many ways to Jess Franco, who we talked about on the last show, in that a lot of the films that he made are basically porn. So, yeah, he made a lot of porn films. He made a couple of horror films. This one is probably his most famous film. His other quite famous film is a film called Beyond the Darkness, which is also called Boyo Omega, which is also probably his best film, in fairness, which, let's just say it has themes of necrophilia.
Yeah.
But still definitely worth watching. It's got scored by members of Goblin, or it might even be Goblin themselves. So yeah, that's actually a pretty good film, as I believe this film is as well. But I'm going to leave it to Ria to tell you what happens in the film, which is called Anthropophagus the Beast.
Yeah, so it's a 1980 film, and the synopsis is a group of tourists become stranded on an uninhabited island where they are stalked by an insane, violent and grotesque killer that slaughtered the town's former residents. So, you know, pretty brief synopsis there. Overall, I thought this film was decent. I feel it does drag a little. Anthropophagus as a title, what does that actually mean? Have you researched into that, or...?
So essentially, an anthropophagus, it just means someone who's like a cannibal.
Oh, okay. Never heard it named in that way before, so that's really interesting. I thought the title was quite different and cool, so well worth looking into. Yeah, I mean, I thought this film, it's a 1980 film, it does look late 70s. It looks rather dated in its visual style. Now, there's this whole scene at the beginning of a German young couple on the beach. It starts out with death. It's quite slow build. They're getting in the sea and exclaiming how it's ice kalt, which is quite funny, but a little slow on the beginning. And it starts with a death scene, but it is nowhere near as cool as Nightmare is with its opening death scene. Like I said, it's a decent film, but a little slow. And there were no subtitles for the whole German section of the beginning of the film for me. But you kind of get the picture. You don't really need to know what they're saying, but it's just quite an odd part of the film to start with.
What I thought was funny is the guy is on the beach. He's listening to this weird electro music on these giant headphones.
Very, very cool 80s headphones. Probably the height of trendiness at the time.
Yes, in Germany, I'm sure. She's probably listening to some craft work, I imagine. Yeah, I had the same issue in that when I started watching the film, I thought, where are the subtitles? What's going on? And it doesn't matter. It's just, a woman, she's in the sea, it's very cold. And then I think D'Amato deliberately tried to rip off Jaws, because it felt very similar to that, in that you got all these underwater shots from below the woman, and yeah, she just gets killed by an unseen force.
Yeah, I think you're right on the whole Jaws thing. I think that they just wanted to put that scene in there for that purpose. So that's why it seems so out of place. And they thought it might grab the audience to begin with. Yeah, I wasn't loving that so much. So yeah, a bit of a slow start. The film does pick up. It's an 11 death film. So not bad, but there were parts of this film where I did feel a little bored. Although the killer is quite interesting at the end, but in fact I did think it was a little bit kind of stilted because his prosthetics do look a bit porridgey, bit of the old porridge on the face, and also I think either they put a wig on him to make him look younger at first, like a hairpiece, and then he's got like receded hair towards the end, so then they take the wig off to make him look more bedraggled and evil with like receded hair, or it's the opposite way round, but I think it's what I've mentioned there, the latter, that they give him some kind of toupee at the beginning to sort of make him look younger and more pristine. But yeah, it's a little weird in that sense.
Yeah, so one of the things I would say about this film, going back to the previous film we discussed, the effects in this film are not all that great. They're all right, but there's a couple of very, very shit effects. So, for example, there's a severed head in a bucket that looks so fake. It's ridiculous.
Yeah, it's really bad. And doesn't she go to like put a foot in there or something like that?
Yeah. So there's a plot point where there's a pregnant woman. We'll get more on her later on in the review. But basically, she's about to get off this boat, and as people seem to do in these kind of films, they just fall over or they just hurt themselves just out of nowhere. So she hurts her ankle, and her way of, helping to reduce the swelling or the pain or whatever is to put her foot in a bucket of water.
Yeah, cold sea water, which then leads to another death of the guy that's looking after her.
Yeah, this is the boat captain. So the effects are not that great. You mentioned sort of the look of George Eastman, which again is not his real name, who also wrote the film, interestingly. So him, along with D'Amato, his real name is Luigi Montefiore, but he is more commonly known as George Eastman. He's quite a well-known sort of Italian genre actor. He appears in various films, one of which I've seen, which is called Rabid Dogs, which is Mario Bava's last film, which is really good. And I would say of the two films that he's in, basically playing the same character that we're going to talk about on the show, I would say this is the better of the two performances. He's sort of more monster-like in this one.
I mean, he's quite a big guy. He's quite menacing looking. He does do this really crappy kind of growl voiceover that they put through most of the film. Another couple of shoddy effects that I've noted down is rats with really fake red eyes.
Yeah.
Which is quite laughable. There's also the old cat on the piano ruse.
Wow,
which is one of the jump scares.
Was actually, I thought, quite funny. First of all, because, I mean, of all the fake cat jump scares that I've ever seen, it's the cutest cat to ever do that. It's this kitten that looked weeks old, literally. This grey kitten just falls on like a piano and starts walking along the piano, which, yes, anyone who's ever owned a cat will know that's exactly what a cat would do, because they just love being annoying like that. But yeah, I found that quite funny as well.
Yeah, and I'm sure there are some other crappy effects that I've noted down.
Well,
Mainly I've noted about his toupee, to be honest.
okay. Clearly, obviously had such a great impact on you. When you were talking earlier about sort of, the film was quite slow. Now, there's two ways of people tend to look at this film. They either look at it in the way I look at it, in the, yes, it is quite slow, but it's got a lot of atmosphere to it for the most part, and it is leading somewhere, and it does have this kind of nightmarish feel to it in a lot of ways. And I think part of that is because of where it's set. So it's set in Greece, which reminded me obviously of Island of Death.
Yeah, of course.
Where, yeah, you've got sort of at the start, you've got all this white kind of buildings everywhere. And then, yeah, when they move on to the island itself, it's got a very odd kind of nightmarish feel, as I said. Or a lot of people view it, and I get the feeling you're more in this category, in that basically it's a lot of people wandering around for an hour and then people start dying.
Yeah, and their boat kind of magically sails off, which means they can't go anywhere after the pregnant lady disappears. And one hilarious part about it is that pregnant lady's called Maggie, and it's night time and she's missing, and they say, oh, we'll look for her in the morning. It's like as if you would leave a pregnant lady out overnight somewhere stranded, possibly murdered. It's just like so terrible.
Yeah, they don't really seem all that bothered that she's missing. It's like, oh, she's just on the boat, it's fine.
Yeah, I mean, like I say, I did quite like the killer and his performance. Not all that realistic, but he was menacing. Some of the deaths are quite fun, but yeah, just felt a little bit like it dragged on for me.
Yeah, now, I mean, I probably enjoy this more than most people, but yes, I can't help but agree with the sentiment that, yes, there are lots of scenes of people wandering very slowly around buildings or caves or whatever. So you've got 3 or 4 different scenes in the film where you have a character with a light, and it differs from scene to scene. So there's one scene where a character is carrying a candle, one where they've got like a torch, one where they've actually got like a flaming torch, wandering around different places, seeing what's going on. And yeah, the atmosphere is really good. The scene in the cave, or the catacombs, whatever it's supposed to be, with all the skeletons and the bats and the shit rats, like you said.
Yeah. It's not bad, actually. The atmosphere is quite cool. I did like the candlelight effect. That is quite creepy. Then it takes this whole twist of the backstory of this family with the huge house, and there is one really effective death. It's a suicide of the woman, and she ties a rope to the banister and jumps off, which is actually quite shocking and really well done. But again, it's like with us discussing Nightmare, it's a little too obvious. It's a little too on the nose that they look into the backstory, they find all these photographs, and then suddenly this whole family connection unravels, and it's all been kind of obvious along the way. So there is that kind of very stilted sort of feel to the twist at the end and all that.
Yeah, I mean, and there's a diary as well. And yeah, they make it seem like that this has been going on for years and years and years, because there's all these dead bodies everywhere, all across the island, just hidden away. Which, yeah, is quite interesting. And yeah, there is one of the many scenes of people wandering around dark rooms where it's all these corpses covered by white sheets that look pretty decayed and decomposed. I thought that looked quite good. That reminded me of the sort of thing that Lucio Fulci would do.
Yeah, that was quite effective and quite suspenseful. You were wondering what was going to kind of jump out.
However, this film, obviously at the time, was quite notorious, and the reason it's notorious is for one scene and one scene alone, which is the scene of the beast ripping a fetus out of the Maggie, the pregnant woman's stomach, and then eating it. Now, This is something that obviously people heard a lot about back in the day, and the film when it did come out on video, was heavily censored, and that scene was taken out of it. Now, if you watch it nowadays in its full uncut glory, like we did, you can see that it's clearly not a fetus. It doesn't even really look like a fetus. Apparently, it's a skinned rabbit.
Yeah, I mean, it still does look pretty grim, and yeah, it's not pleasant to look at. You can tell it's not a real fetus, but it's still unpleasant.
Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, I mean, clearly, sort of, people back in the 80s, they didn't know any better, which is why the film is so notorious. And people actually thought it was a genuine snuff movie at points, which is hilarious.
Yeah, I mean, we obviously knew that wasn't the case, but it's still quite a shocking part of the film. And the concept itself, I can see why it was banned specifically for that point. When that came on screen, I thought, yeah, I think they've gone too far with this, really. Even though you can tell that it's fake, so...
Yeah, I mean, based purely on that scene alone, because that is really the only contentious thing in the whole film itself, would you say that makes it a video nasty, or are you not convinced?
I'm going to say yes, because of the way that it is done, and that you can tell it's some kind of dead, once living thing, but you can't quite tell what it was. It just has that kind of look of like a bloody corpse, I guess, like animal corpse. It's quite grim looking, so I'm gonna say yes, because the way that they've shot it is quite shocking, and just the fact that it is a pregnant woman and they're killing her, like, it's one of the no-nos of horror, really. Everybody knows that that's really controversial. It's like the whole film Mother, we were just waiting for that controversy. They push it to that limit, and everybody knows that is a sensitive topic to cover in a horror film. So I'm going to say yes. I can understand if you say no because of how fake it looks, but I still think that they did go a bit too far with that.
I mean, like you say, I did and ahh a little bit about it because it's the only thing in the film that's maybe a little bit controversial. And at the end of the day, I didn't think it was that disturbing in the end. I mean, you can tell, first of all, clearly it doesn't look like a fetus. Like I said, because it's a skinned rabbit, it just looks like a big ball of meat, really. And it's almost a bit silly more than anything else. It's just, yeah, almost kind of funny, but yeah, I can totally get why someone would be disturbed by this. Yeah, you mentioned Mother. I mean, it's been long enough since Mother's come out now. Yes, there is a scene in Mother which is kind of similar to this. It's not as it's not as flat out in your face as this is, but yeah, it's pretty similar. But you know, hey, Mother isn't a video nasty.
Yeah, I mean, they've deliberately not shown it that far because they knew that the general public would radically object to that, and there's a reason for it. Whereas in Anthropophagus, they've done it deliberately, probably to get that controversy. So,
okay. I mean, I like the film. As I said, I find it to be very atmospheric. Yeah, not really a lot happens, but I like the overall production design. I like the look of the island. I like the locations that they managed to shoot on. And I do think the film has a lot of atmosphere, and that is helped by the score, which I think is really good, actually, for the most part. The opening track over the credits is sort of this very Greek sounding, sort of very traditional kind of song, I guess, but the rest of it is very kind of discordant, and I like that aspect of it. And yeah, I found the films to be quite atmospheric. I probably like this more than most kind of video nasties fans, I would say, which is why I own it on DVD, because again, it's available on DVD from those fine people at 88 Films on both DVD and Blu-ray. So if you want to check this out in its fully uncut glory, that's how you would do it.
Yeah, and I did like the music in that, but of all of the three nasties that we're going to talk about on this show, that was my least favourite, although I still thought it was a valuable watch. Nightmare was my favourite, and this next one we're about to discuss was my next favourite, so I preferred the music in this, which I thought was really excellent as well. Very good 80s music.
Yeah, I would say the music is definitely the best thing about the film that we're going to discuss right now, which is Absurd, which is also directed by Joe D'Amato, although he doesn't use that name in direction of this film. He goes under the pseudonym Peter Newton, which is very, very Anglophiled. Because what you'll notice is in the credits, with one exception, which is ironically the guy who does the awesome score of the film, everyone uses these kind of very fake American-looking names. So Luigi Montefiore, who's also in the film as the Beast, he also wrote this one, and he goes under the name John Cart, which is very, very interesting. So this one also has the alternative names of Anthropophagus 2 or Grim Reaper 2, because this film is kind of a sequel to Anthropophagus, but it's not really in a lot of ways. Also has the other alternative titles of The Monster Hunter, Horrible, which is like, okay, and finally Zombie 6 Monster Hunter, because this, I guess, in some places must have been marketed as the fifth sequel to Dawn of the Dead, which is quite weird.
I quite like that title, Horrible, even though it seems a little straightforward, but Absurd is definitely the best title. So anyway, it's a 1981 film, so it's a year after Anthropophagus, so he was quite quick off the mark with this, and the synopsis is: a priest comes to a small town to help get rid of a monster whose blood coagulates very fast. This creates problems as the monster is very hard to kill and then decides to go on a killing spree of its very own. So essentially it's about superhuman strength monster serial killer.
Pretty much, yes. So the guy who does the awesome music in this film, his name's Carlo Maria Cordio, who also did the music for Cannibal Ferox, which is awesome and funky, which I actually played at the end of episode 3, which is where we discuss Cannibal Ferox. Now, the music in those films is great. Unfortunately, he also did the music for Troll 2, which is not very good, like the rest of the film.
Yeah, but that film's got cult following, though, so, I mean, you can't really go wrong, can you? At least he's known.
Exactly. It's better to be known for something than not known for anything at all.
Yeah, and as mentioned at the beginning of our show, here is where our compass comes in this film.
Yes, there's a very key scene that involves a compass later on. Now, your feelings on Anthropophagus, that's kind of how I feel about this film, in that you've got some kind of awesome, gruesome deaths, and the rest of the film is just a bit boring.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of agree with you, but I liked this one more than Anthropophagus. I think it was the killer that I warmed to more. In this film, he looks really huge, menacing. I really liked the performance. I thought the backstory with like the superhuman strength was a little obvious. But I quite liked the characters in this film. I think I liked the characters more than I liked the characters in Anthropophagus. And I thought that the deaths in the house towards the end were quite well set up and quite suspenseful. We've got Katia, the girl who is bedridden and she can't move, suddenly gets this miraculous recovery at the end, even though her head is in a neck brace throughout the whole thing. Suddenly she's able to move freely and also be thrown around by her hair, which is a little over the top, but also is quite a cool scene with a very suspenseful and built up ending to it. So I enjoyed that a little bit more than Anthropophagus.
Yeah, so this one is a lot more influenced by Halloween than the first one. So Anthropophagus came out just after Halloween. It was sort of trying to cash in on the success of Halloween, but it isn't really very... It doesn't have that many kind of similarities to Halloween. This one has a lot more similarities to Halloween, and Halloween 2 in a lot of ways. So a lot of it is set in a hospital, so that kind of makes it similar to Halloween 2. You've got a character that is basically the Dr. Loomis character, who's the Reverend, who's played by Edmund Purdom, who's actually in Pieces, which is an awesomely funny film for anyone who's ever seen that.
Highly recommend. I love that film.
Yeah, so you've got him kind of chasing around the main character, and that's really about it. He doesn't really offer anything really to the rest of the plot. And the
Yeah.
plot in itself is just a mishmash of different things. So what they've tried to do is quite hilarious actually, is they've tried to make it look as American as possible. So everyone, all they're interested in is the big game of American football.
Oh
So
God, yeah, that was so annoying. In fact, it's kind of like The Room, where they've always got American football throughout the film, and it's completely unnecessary.
chipper, chipper, chipper.
Yeah.
Yeah, but what makes it even funnier is these people, they're going to watch the big game, but they're all really, really dressed up and they're having this very, very posh dinner party,
Like a
watching,
soiree, yeah.
yeah, watching the Super Bowl and eating huge bowls of pasta. Now, fair enough, if this was New York in the Italian section, I could buy that, but clearly this is not meant to be that. This is meant to be sort of very sort of rich, well-to-do people just eating these big bowls of spaghetti, watching
Yeah.
American football, which is ridiculous.
I did find quite a lot of similarities to Nightmares in a Damaged Brain as well, in that the fact that there's this annoying son in it called Willie, who is also a terrible actor. There's quite hilarious talk of so the priest and the serial killer are both Greek because they find Greek drachma in the killer's pocket, which shows you how old school this film is. Drachma, I mean, God, I remember using those. Yeah, a lot of points, several points in this film. One of the nurses says that the serial killer, it seems he was a foreigner, which I found hilarious. It was just like, God, you'd never say that in a film these days. It's just like so old-fashioned. And yeah, there's like some really cool deaths. I think that's why I preferred it to Anthropophagus, actually. There's some awesome deaths, like there's a death with a bandsaw through a guy's head, which is really, really cool. And towards the end, the babysitter gets her head burnt in an oven. He holds her head in an oven, which is really cool. Aside from that, like you say, it is a little slow going and a little bit all over the place. But not bad overall.
Yeah, I mean, that bandsaw death is the best death in the whole film, I thought, just because it's very similar to, again, the kind of deaths that like Lucio Fulci has in his films, where you got someone and you know they're going to die, and they kind of like, you know, tease the audience a little bit before the actual effects kick in. And when they do kick in, it's quite interesting. On the last show, we talked about a person being killed by a saw, and in this film, obviously, someone gets killed with a saw as well, although it's a different type of saw. But the effect was kind of much more effective. It wasn't like a fake head going flying off.
No, it's quite well done, actually. It was almost like they had fake skin filled with something and they were actually sawing through some kind of rubber or latex or something, which was very effective as a close-up. Again, like Nightmare, you've got that whole bursting through the door kind of effect, Shining-esque, Jack Nicholson style. So you've got that as well. And quite an effective use of, I did think it was weird how they had Katia, the bedridden girl, drawing circles repetitively in an OCD sort of way with this compass, and that's the only thing she wants to do. I'm like, how is this going to be useful? And she ends up using that as a weapon later on to stab the killer in the eye, in both eyes, which is absolutely hilarious because his eyes suddenly become very sealed shut and red with like a hole directly in the middle, which is just really bizarre. And then there's this quite cool sort of very well built up scene at the end where he can't see, and she puts music on very loudly, like classical music, to kind of hide her footsteps, and she's very closely sort of running away from him, but he doesn't know that she's so close. So that I thought that was quite cool the way that was done. But yeah, the use of compass as a weapon is quite bizarre, but kind of funny as well.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's the only way that you're going to believably conceive of the fact that you've got this huge guy who is basically completely invincible apart from his brain, which is quite funny.
Yeah.
And then you got him against this crippled girl. And yeah, it kind of gives her sort of almost, you know, it levels the playing field as such, in that he can't see. So in theory, if it was a fair fight, he could just kill her instantly. Now, interestingly, compared to Nightmares in a Damaged Brain, he doesn't kill the children, even though he could have done quite easily a couple of times, I think. But yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, I don't really like children, but yes, killing children on camera is pretty grim, and most people wouldn't like it or go for it. So yeah, I can see why they wouldn't have that.
Yeah,
But
it was almost a little too easy, and they didn't go for that, which I respect. I can see why they've not done that. And there are 7 deaths in this film, so not quite as many as the other films that we've discussed, but still, a good one. And yeah, I can see why you don't like this one so much. Both this one and Anthropophagus are a little slow going, and you can tell it's been done by the same director. But yeah, I did think that the serial killer in this film was menacing, and physically he's a big guy, and it does work very well in the film. So yeah, it was interesting. Not my favourite of Video Nasties, but still well worth a watch.
yeah, there are a couple of other deaths that I did quite enjoy as well that I thought were quite good. So the first death of the film is a nurse getting drilled from temple to temple by a drill, or whatever the fuck that was supposed to be.
Yeah.
I thought that was quite effective.
It's like a small surgical drill, perhaps for bone matter or something like that.
And then you've got the babysitter who for some reason has been dubbed into Irish. I'm not quite sure why. At one point she has this great line. It's like, quit that sniffling or the bogeyman will be getting you.
Oh yeah. Ridiculous.
Yeah, very, very stupid. She gets a pickaxe to the top of her head, which I thought was quite effective.
Yeah, and then you've got the woman who gets her head put in the oven, and she then comes out all burnt and tries to stab the killer with the scissors, which I thought was quite effective. It's quite distressing. Her face gets redder and redder, and he's holding it in there, and the point of view of the camera is from the back of the oven, so it's quite well shot.
Yeah, and that interestingly is played by Annie Bell, who's in House on the Edge of the Park.
Yeah. And there's like a really nice kind of ending as well, where Katia is the one that does prevail by killing our serial killer in the end, and she does behead him and hold up the head, which looks ridiculously fake, but it was quite a nice ending and quite heroic, so did quite enjoy it. It was satisfying, even though it was ridiculously fake.
Yeah, I thought it was quite satisfying as well. I would say, just as endings go, it's like, well, he can't really come back now, can he? Like, once you've had your head cut off, that's it. You're pretty fucked, aren't you?
Yeah, I would say so. We never found out what happened to the dog Blitz, because I didn't see him come back, which is a shame.
And what a name for a dog, by the way.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the film itself, I mean, just to round this one up, I mean, it's all right. I mean, the first 30 or 40 minutes to me were unbearably slow and barely anything was going on. There was no real narrative momentum going on. And then after that, it did sort of pick up, and it was more, I was more with it at that point. I just think with the narrative, there's a lot of things that just happen and they don't really lead to anything. Like, for example, the killer, he gets hit by a car which is driven by the dad of Willie and Katya, but then those characters never interact for the rest of the film at all. In fact, the parents may as well not even have really been in the film. They don't really do an awful lot. So I just think they were trying to, again, this is probably D'Amato and Eastman, they were trying to rip off Halloween, where you've got the babysitter angle looking after the children and you've got this unstoppable killing machine coming after them. But yeah, it doesn't really tie together very well. It needed the rug from The Big Lebowski. It would have tied the whole plot together.
Excellent. But yeah, it does seem like they're kind of box ticking throughout this. So at the end, when she's like blood-soaked young girl in a nightie and she's holding up a severed head, it's all quite sort of Carrie-esque looking, and ties the film together with a nice menacing image at the end. Very satisfying as well, because obviously the baddie gets his comeuppance. And they do have a lot of the power cut goes on, and there's no phone line and all that kind of standard slasher stuff. So it does feel like box ticking without much explanation. And the only part where they discuss the fact that he hit him with the car was him establishing that he feels really guilty about it, but it doesn't really play a big part in the film, as you say. So yeah, a little weak on the plot, but you know, very 80s slasher, and pretty standard as those sort of films go.
So, in terms of video nasty, I don't think it is, personally. I mean, it's very gory in places, but I mean, other than that, there isn't really anything that's offensive or sleazy or anything like that. So I'm going to say no for this one.
Yeah, I'm going to say no as well, because it's not really gory enough to warrant it, to be fair.
Cool. Now, I'm not repeating myself, this is not a broken record. This film is also available on DVD from 88 Films. So 88 Films have actually released all 3 films that we're talking about on the show today. Can you believe it? So if you like your Italian video nasties, it's basically them and Arrow are the people who you want to kind of go to. I don't actually own this one for reasons that should be apparent if you've been paying attention to the show. It's, you know, it's alright, it's got some cool deaths, but it's not something that I would kind of want to watch again, let's put it that way.
Not essential, but if you're on a video nasties 80s slasher run and you want to give this a watch, it's alright, in my opinion. But yeah, not amazing. It won't change your life.
No, but I mean, it's quite interesting when you watch these 3 films that we've discussed today in terms of like the American slasher counterpart. So it's quite a cool like little comparison to make between like these 3 and the rest, because they are clearly slasher films. Well, I think they are anyway. But they're doing things that are totally different from what your run-of-the-mill slasher films are trying to do. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, it's a good creative effort, and I do feel that compared to even some modern horror films today, these do stand up well, and you know they've done something that's notable. Whereas you do get a lot of modern horrors that really don't; they just play it very safe. So I do admire these kinds of films, despite the fact that they're not really like incredible. But I do think creatively it's a great thing. It's great that they made them.
Yeah, the deaths are certainly like sort of put them above sort of slasher films in a lot of ways, because some very, very hilariously violent deaths in there on the show today.
Indeed, yeah, particularly the compass.
Yep, can't forget about that compass.
Mm-hmm.
Which brings us to the end of the show today. So I want to thank you very much for listening. We appreciate every time that everyone listens to one of our shows. Please tell as many people as you can if you've enjoyed the show. Recommend us to your friends, anyone who's into their fucked up horror films or just horror generally, who wants to, you know, spend like hour and a half or so of their time with us. Absolutely hope that you would let them know about us. The usual plugs. My name's Greg Knox. This is the Lament Configuration. You can find us on Facebook under the Lament Configuration podcast. You can find us on Twitter at Lament Horror. You can find us on our dedicated YouTube channel where we put up all our shows, plus possibly other content, you know, as we get sort of towards the middle of the year, coming up to Fright Fest sort of time. And you can also find us on Podbean, on Stitcher, and on TuneIn Radio.
Yes, and as always, I have been reaffirmed. Please give us 5 stars on iTunes and a review if you get a chance. That would absolutely make my day. Noticed quite a few clocking up on there, so thank you very much for that. As always, you can find me on my Facebook page for modelling, acting and podcast work, anything else that I've been up to. Thanks so much for pushing me past 65,000 followers and approaching 70 and then hopefully onto 100, which is incredible. Thank you so much. That's my page, Reoffend, that's F-E-N-D. And I'm also on Twitter and Instagram at Ria_Fend. And I'll be looking forward to the next show. We're getting incredibly near the end of the video nasties now. If you've missed any of our previous shows, you can find the entire back catalogue on iTunes and YouTube, so you can go back and listen to other banned 80s and 70s horror movies that we have spoken about from the video nasties list, which comprises 72 films. And that's all from me.
Awesome. So on the next show, we're going to be covering, yes, more video nasties. We only have 3 video nasty shows left to go. Wow, I can't believe it's we're actually nearly at the end of the video nasties now. I'm actually getting quite excited. So as I mentioned, the next show is going to be more Italian video nasties, this time with a more supernatural feel to them. So really looking forward to talking about those. One of those is actually, yeah, probably one of my favourite video nasties on the list. And I'm going to leave you with some of the awesome music from Absurd that we talked about earlier. It's really awesome. It's probably my favourite bit of the whole film, actually, if I'm being honest. And I wish you all a very, very good day.
Toodles!